Chapter 23. So this is Demography, Culture, and the Environment, 1900 to the present. And this is it. This is the end. This is the last chapter. So this is going to wrap everything else up. Remember, the last three chapters are about different parts of quote-unquote modern society, things that have happened in the recent past. So if you're one of the people who prefers learning about the more recent past, this class should be good for you, because normally you don't get 3 whole chapters totally devoted to what's going on recently. I assume everybody knows that this is planet Earth. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today has to do with climate, as well as people, the movement of people, the migrations of people. So here we have a vegetable grower moving from a rural village in the country of Chad to the capital city, because his life, as he says, my life is easier now. I live right next to the market. I have more time to be with my family, and I can get a better price for my vegetables as well. And my big wish is for my children to go to school, echoing the hopes and dreams of many people as they migrate from more rural areas to more urban areas. Not necessarily cities. This can include suburban areas as well. More recently, especially with the pandemic, we've seen a huge influx of people leaving cities and moving to more suburban areas. But many people, and not just, don't just think about it in terms of the United States, because certainly we have access to education no matter where you are. It's a part of modern living in the United States. But think about a country like Chad and in Africa, or a rural community in another third world nation, and think about how little access they might have to education in a rural area. And so for millions of these people, going to the city means access to education. Another thing we're going to be looking at is climate change. For example, Lake Chad has shrunk in response to climate change and the overuse of that lake. And the 20th century human journey is marked by population growth, movement of people, changing cultural identity, and human impact of the environment, all of which we'll be looking at. So, more people, quadrupling human numbers. So the 20th century, so again, that means 1900s. So 1900 all the way up to the year 2000, saw a population explosion that had no precedent in history. Now, this occurred mostly in developing countries. In fact, in many industrial countries, in many first world countries, the birth rate has actually declined more recently, pretty significantly. Now, that again is in the latter half of the 20th century. This is also due to lower death rates, which is due to advancing medical technology, meaning people are living longer, lower infant mortality because of advancing medical technology. Babies that might have been born and unfortunately died 200 years ago now can live due to better medical technology, and also agricultural innovations. Less people are needed to produce more food to feed the population. So we have access to more food, which of course helps people live better lives. By 2000, population growth started to slow. Now, this is particularly true in the first world countries, but also other nations as well. Birth rates dropped. This is due to widely available birth control, women entering the workforce and choosing to postpone having children, choosing to have less children, or choosing to not have children at all. And increasingly, it's become economically very difficult to have a large family. Not that there was ever a time that it was easy to have a large family, but certainly there was a time in which it was economically necessary to have a large family. If you owned a farm and you needed many hands to make light works on that farm, then again, it was necessary. Certainly still expensive, but not the case so much today, especially in think about the United States, in which you hope to have a college education for your children, and that, of course, is very expensive. So here we see a fertility variant projection, and you can see over time what countries are going to be gaining population and which countries are going to be losing population. And so you can see in the year 2010, a gain from 55% to 60% from the continent of Asia, but then a decline. And you see a large gain in Africa. So going from 9% in 1950, 15% to 2010, 25 in 2050 projected. Again, these are projected, obviously. And 39% in the year 2100. So there's going to be some big changes there. And look at the shrinking population of Europe from 22% to 11 to 8 to 6. And so certainly that is going to be a big change globally. We also see global urbanization. You see the huge growth of urban areas after 1900, so cities and surrounding suburbs. There's a reduced need for rural labor with the Green Revolution. Again, you need less people to produce more crops because of advances in agricultural technology, and you have increased urban employment opportunities. You also see increasing urban life expectancies with better infrastructure and healthcare. It used to be cities were the places of diseases. If we think back, 200 years and beyond, the people living so close together in crowded areas with very poor medical care and advancements at the time, that was where you would go. You would escape to the country, to rural areas if you could, to escape, plagues and things like that. And that's not the case anymore. You also see varied timing to growth with wars and depressions. This hasn't been, again, an even trajectory of people moving to cities. If war is going on, that obviously is going to interfere with that, economic depressions, etc. Now, this has had some profound environmental impacts. We'll get into that. And also great economic inequality. As you can see here, the title of this is pretty apt, Slums and Skyscrapers. You can see some really advanced modern skyscrapers in the background with a slum in the foreground where you have people living quite literally in shacks right next door to these high-end high-rises. You also see long-distance migration. A growing number of people have moved abroad. There are greater regulations of travelers. There's also new patterns of migration in which people are moving for labor. They might move around, varying from place to place on the time of year, depending on what jobs are available. And migrants also must balance assimilation with maintaining culture. And there's a potential conflict if they do not assimilate or integrate. And this is a problem of migrants or immigrants the world over. Since people have been moving around, it's been an issue, and it continues to be an issue, and it continues to be a surprise to people. It seems like every new group of people that immigrates or migrates to, let's say, to our nation, the United States, it seems like it's such a surprise to people. But this has been something that's been going on, and accepting people of different cultures, unfortunately, has been something that has been difficult since we became a nation. You can go back in time and read about people's prejudices towards people of varying, to immigrants and migrants, going all the way back to colonial times. So it unfortunately is not something that's new. Okay, so here we have a map showing the major routes of migration from 1990 to 2000. And you can see where many people are heading. A lot of people heading into North America, into the United States and Canada. You see a lot of people heading into Western Europe. A lot of people, and look at the nations that they are heading out of as well. And you can again see that there's a vast amount of people on the move in search of jobs, in search of a better life, etc. As people move around, there are diseases that get spread as well. A lot of people with the recent COVID-19 outbreak have made parallels to the influenza pandemic. That's the Spanish flu, which lasted from 1918 to 1919, which was greatly exacerbated by the end of World War I. As World War I ended, soldiers were all over the world, and they were all coming home, and they were all in movement, and that helped spread this very deadly disease. We have the HIV/AIDS pandemic of the 1980s. And modern communication means that reports spread faster, and governments have tried to keep diseases out, though, as we've all witnessed, not always successfully. The World Health Organization was created to help combat these, and recently, we know, there have been many new diseases to be frightened of: SARS, Ebola, the Zika virus, and of course, COVID-19. And we already kind of talked about this, but this is something, again, that's continuing on: race, nation, and ethnicity. As people are in motion, these things get called into question. And we know that in the 20th century, the idea of race became prominent. Remember, technically, we use the term race differently than it is scientifically. Technically, there is only one race. There's only Homo sapiens. Ethnicity is technically a better term to use, but the term race became prominent into the 20th century. And in the 1950s, it was really given a quote-unquote bad name by the Nazi regime. And this, of course, has been scientifically disproven. We're all Homo sapiens. We, of course, have different ethnicities, and that we can't ignore the fact that that has had a huge impact on every culture. But going forward, nationalism was seen as a stronger driving force than race as a form of identity and loyalty, which drove the two world wars. However, globalization has challenged national loyalties, as ethnically distinct people have argued for their own political status. Popular culture is also on the move. We have cultural globalization. We have multiple media forms: music, film, fashion. Think about how fast a trend can go around the world now, especially with the use of social media. And think about even just 50 years ago, or even just think about 20 years ago, and how much quicker things can get out into the world. It's pretty amazing. You also have a fear of cultural imperialism or homogenization. There's a strong push, for instance, by some Islamic nations against contamination, against this, again, cultural homogenization. Well, if trends can be out in the world due to social media and even just traditional media within seconds, that can also help to lessen local traditions, and that can be seen as a negative by many. And you also have a cultural flow into the West as well. So it's not just the West imposing their culture on everybody else, as was the case until very recently. You also see an inflow of different kinds of food, medicine, movies, TV, music. All right, so where does religion stand in this era of global modernity? Quote-unquote advanced thinkers of the 18th to 20th century believed that supernatural religion was heading for extinction, and we have seen that to not be the case. There has been a sharp decline in religious belief and practice in some places, but not worldwide. And the spread of scientific culture has convinced small minorities that the only realities worth considering were those that could be measured scientifically. But the most prominent trends of the last century have been the further trans-regional spread of major world religions, their resurgence in new forms, and their attacks on elements of a secular and global modernity. So, again, we have not seen the overall decline in some sort of religious belief. Buddhist ideas and practices have been well received in the West. Christianity has spread even farther. 62% of Christians live in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Oceania. So, again, not in Western Europe or the United States. Islam has also spread widely, and religious pluralism is in the world on a level never seen before, meaning there are many different types of religion represented all over the world. So here you can see the practice of yoga in the United States. This is obviously a pre-COVID picture, and that is something that, of course, I'm sure everybody knows is very popular, and it has a spiritual element to it, back to the Hindu faith, which is where it originated. So obviously, this is clearly a more secular form of it, but again, it's an element of religion which has spread globally. Religious fundamentalism is also a major reaction against modernization and globalization, so it's a pushback against what is seen as modernity. It's defined by a militant piety. It tends to be very defensive and exclusive, and it has developed in every major religious tradition. We tend to think of Christian fundamentalism as representative of all religious fundamentalism, but that's not true. You can see it in, again, every major world religion. Many features of the modern world appear threatening to established religion. For instance, it's upset customary class, family, and gender relationships. And industrialization, imperialism, capitalism, and globalism are all impacted as well. So the term fundamentalism comes to the U.S. As religious conservatives in the early 20th century called for a return to the fundamentals of Christianity. There's, in fact, a book written about the fundamentals of Christianity, and that is the origin of that term, fundamentalism. Many saw the United States as on the edge of a moral abyss. This really took off in the 1920s. And in the 1970s, religious fundamentalism began to enter the political arena as the religious right. There's also been fundamentalism in the Hindu faith developed in India in the 1980s, which also became a political party, promoting a distinct Hindu identity in education, culture, and religion, which has seen some electoral success in 2014. Islamic fundamentalism is probably the most prominent fundamentalism of the late 20th century. There have been great disappointments in the Muslim world by the 1970s. New states such as Egypt, Iran, and Algeria pursued basically Western and secular policies. These new policies were largely unsuccessful, and foreign intrusion continued. And so the penetration of fundamentalist thought in the Islamic world by the 1970s is evident. You see movements for the Islamization of public life, increased religious observance, many women voluntarily adopting modest dress and veils, many governments using Islamic rhetoric and practice as an anchor. A series of Islamic organizations were also formed to provide social services, Islamic activists becoming leaders in unions and professional organizations, as well as an entry into politics. Now, this is different from Islamic radicalism, which is centered on violent attacks, usually on civilians, by various radical groups and the Islamic State, for example, September 11th. There tends to be a renewal of Islamic radicalism when social services are lacking or are non-existent, as is the case for any kind of radical movement. Again, think about the rise of the Nazis in Germany during the losses of World War I and then the Great Depression. These things don't tend to happen when times are stable and times are good. And of course, I'd like to emphasize that radicalism is different from fundamentalism. And humankind and the environment. So going into climate change, the global environment has been transformed. 3 factors have magnified the human impact on the environment because, of course, since time humans have been around, we have impacted our environment. But more recently, population growth, requiring more agriculture, and complex civilizations have stressed the environment. Now, there have been an uneven spread of all 3 all over the world, but economic growth came to appear possible and desirable almost everywhere. So, human environmental disruptions are now of global proportion. There's huge amounts of cropland and corresponding contraction of forests, grasslands, and wetlands, numerous extinctions of plants and animal species, air pollution in many major cities and rivers. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of different waterways or different cities during the COVID-19 shutdowns and how clean everything got once humans were not allowed to intervene as much in the environment. The thinning of the ozone layer and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is exactly what you think it is. If you don't know what it is, it's a great floating mass of trash in the Pacific Ocean. Here you can see some urban pollution in Beijing, it being so polluted that people are forced to wear masks to not breathe in pollution into their lungs. Climate change has become the most pressing global issue by the early 21st century as greenhouse gases continue to warm the planet. Again, this is something we're continuing to live with, so we haven't seen the end game of this yet. Carbon dioxide and methane from fossil fuels, things like nitrous oxide from fertilizer, resulting in melting glaciers, melting polar ice caps, more extreme weather. Sometimes this means more rainfall in some areas or more droughts in others. Warmer and more acidic oceans and lakes, more forest fires. Think about all the most recent California forest fires, and plants and animals migrating to escape these changes. And so there are some pretty bleak projections for climate change if it is left unchecked. Here we see carbon dioxide concentrations from 1750 to 2017. And you can see the huge increase with the oncoming of the European Union, of course, is 28 different countries, because again, I want to emphasize Europe is a continent, not a country. Okay, so there have been movements, as I'm sure everybody is aware, to protect the environment. Environmentalism actually began back in the 19th century, 1800s, but at the time it did not have a mass following, but Romantic writers showed a growing awareness of impact on the environment as industrialization took off. And John Muir was the first one to really kind of put this together and try to put this for a movement, at least in the United States, the founder of the Sierra Club. Environmentalism only became a global phenomenon in the second half of the 20th century, so it took a while. It possibly began in the West with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, which was focused on the use of different kinds of toxins and their impact on the environment and killing off different animals. And again, we say possibly because we're living in this era. This is something that's ongoing. We can't properly draw a lot of conclusions because we don't know, because we're in the midst of it. A lot of action has come from grassroots and citizen protests, which have increased within recent years. Additionally, environmentalism has taken root in the global south in the 70s and the 80s. They tend to be here more locally based, involving poor people, more concerned with food security, health, and survival than in the global north, and more focused on saving threatened people from development projects and ranchers rather than for plants and animals. Environmentalists have sometimes sought basic changes in political and social structure of their country. For example, Philippine activism against foreign mining companies. So, not surprisingly, as I hope I've emphasized throughout this course, you can't really make a ton of broad generalizations in history. And so the environmental movement very much impacted by the country and the nation in question. Environmentalism has become a matter of global concern in the early 21st century. There's been legislation to control pollution in many countries, the encouragement for businesses to become green, reforestation programs in some countries, international agreement on a number of issues, such as the Paris Climate Accord, which took place in 2015, and millions of people adopting more greener lifestyles is becoming much more mainstream as years go on. But there are sharp conflicts between the global north and south. Clean energy would require a complete lifestyle adjustment here in the global north, which many people are not keen on. In 2017, the Trump administration officially withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, but in 2021, President Biden has rejoined that agreement. And northern efforts to control pollution and global warming could limit the South's industrial development, which is something that at these global summits that they have tried to address, how to make environmentalism not a hardship on developing nations. Because the argument from the other side is, well, you're already developed, you've already gotten the benefit of industrialization, and now you want to put limits on us as we industrialize, etc. So again, the developing countries perceive the developed ones as unwilling to give up their extravagance to really help matters. Nonetheless, global environmentalism has come to symbolize the focus on the plight of all humankind, because this is something that touches everybody. It's a challenge to modernity itself, especially a commitment to endless growth and growing importance of ideas of sustainability and restraint. So, our final reflections. World history and the making of meaning. People assign greater significance to their actions, and one great task of historians is to trace these meanings, and meanings do change over time. Historians create meanings and give definition to the human past, which helps us to create context for our own lives. Again, it's very difficult to fully understand what's going on in a society without understanding, well, where did we come from and how did we get here? And world history can help us construct more meaningful lives by illustrating the lives of unfamiliar people. It also helps to explore the roots and development of America's understanding of itself as the police of the world. This is something that really took off during the Teddy Roosevelt administration and has continued on to the modern world. And also to consider what aspects of American culture are most offensive to people in other parts of the world. We just mentioned the United States as being part of the developed nation, and a lot of resentment that people feel towards our contribution to the environmental crisis. Helps to examine why the United States waged the Gulf War and the Iraq War, more recent wars, and to investigate what the implications of those two wars have been in perceptions of the United States abroad.